This presentation is about distinguishing tense, mood, and aspect. These are three verb systems in English. Now, it's true that English has a fourth, and that's voice. You're probably familiar with distinguishing a sentence as being active or being passive. That's the voice system, whether something's active or passive. We're going to deal with that one a lot later in the semester. So for right now, we're dealing with these three: tense, mood, and aspect. They're all things about verbs, so it's pretty important to be able to tell them apart. There are actually two tense systems, a primary tense system and a secondary tense system. Here you can see the way that verbs categorize in each of the systems. There are only two dimensions. They're not as complicated as they could be, right? The primary tense, it can only be either present or preterite. Secondary tense can only be either perfect or not perfect, which is the default. Aspect, only two systems. It's the default or it's progressive. Mood, also only two systems. It's either modal or it's not. Not too complicated, right? Here's the thing to remember. Each of these systems is purely syntactic. They can be distinguished based on the form of the sentence alone without even knowing the meaning. You don't have to pay attention to the meaning. And in some cases, paying attention to the meaning would actually confuse you. You have to really be able to focus on the form. That's going to be the theme of this presentation pretty much. Okay, now let's look first at the primary tense system. The ways of categorizing here are either present or preterite. Every sentence has to pick one of those. Those are the only two choices. Here are a couple that are present. You identify sentences or clauses rather that are in the present tense because their verb is either a plain present or a third singular present. It's one of the present forms of the verb, and there are two, right? There's the plain present like see, and there's the third singular present like opens. If the head verb of the clause is in either one of those forms, then it's a present tense clause. Notice that it doesn't matter whether what the clause is talking about is referring to the present time or not. Neither of these sentences really are, right? She opens tomorrow night. That's about the future, right? The other one, I see them all the time. That's not like if you're looking right at me, right, and you're saying I see you. That's present time, right? But this one is I see them all the time. That's just recurring. So neither of these are really about the exact present time. It doesn't matter. It's just that the verbs are in a present form. There you go. You've got present clauses. Okay? The other dimension was preterite, right? Again, preterite verb forms don't have to refer to past time. It's just completely irrelevant. Look at this interesting example, I think. Look at the sentences in this little story. Let's see. We can pick out verbs like told, again told, did, went, and went. Those are all preterites, right? So all of these clauses are preterite clauses. You can call the clauses past tense. It's a lot less important whether you call a clause past or preterite than it is to say the preterite form of the verb. Saying the preterite form of the verb is kind of a matter of being precise for reasons that I don't want to really go into right now. But if you want to call a clause a past clause, that's fine. It's not going to hurt your analysis. So let's say, told him I had a band, past tense, right? I don't know, present tense, but referring to present time. So in the first 5 sentences here, we have pretty good correspondence between form of the verb and the clause and time that's being referred to. The preterite clauses, the past clauses, are all actually referring to past time. If you imagine the time that the guy told the story as being the present, right? And I don't know is referring to the present time. But then what happens? Check out this clause. And he says to me, and the next one too, well, skip that one. It's reported speech, right? Can you do these two dates? And then, and hands me a napkin. Says and hands. Definitely present form verbs, right? These are definitely present clauses. Are they talking about the present time when he's actually saying them? No, not at all. He's telling a story, and these are things that happened in the story. They're just as much past tense as I told him I had a band, right? Now, if you want to talk about this in discourse terms, we have a word for it. We call it the historical present. That's not a term that has any relevance in grammar. Okay, it might have some relevance, but it's not relevant to describing clauses. It's not relevant to the tense system. The tense system, just forget about the meaning and look at the form. He says to me is a present clause. And in fact, the fact that we can say it's present, but it's used to talk about past time, the fact that we keep the grammatical dimension separate is what allows us to make terms like historical present, because we define those as the syntax is present, but the action, the meaning is actually past. Okay, that is the tense system in English. It's just present and preterite. English doesn't have a future tense. You'll have to concede this point, at least for the purposes of this class. If you've studied a language like French, Spanish, or Italian, probably a considerable number of other languages that I'm not too familiar with, you will have seen a future tense, I think. Here's an example for you from French. If we take the phrase, une équipe qui gagne, this is a team that wins, or a team who wins. If we want to put it in the future tense, we say une équipe qui gagnera. See the ra at the end, the ra. That's a morpheme, that's a suffix. And what it does is it changes the verb to future. Now that's a future tense. English doesn't have a suffix or a prefix or anything you can do to your verb that changes it to future tense. We have this, a team that will win. If we're going to translate this, we have to say a team that will win. Will is not a suffix on the verb. It's not a tense, right? In the same way that z makes a present tense or d makes a past tense, right? Will is not like that. Will is actually a modal, and we're going to talk about those when we get to the mood system. It's a modal auxiliary. Okay. Now let's look at the secondary tense system. And the dimensions here are a sentence is either perfect or it's not. It's either the default or it's a perfect sentence. Here are some perfect ones. Filmmakers have begun. Worse things have occurred. You see the perfect constructions? How do we make them? We can define this syntactically. They use the auxiliary verb have, right? That's conjugated. It could be has. And they use the lexical verb in the past participle form. Begun, occurred. Remember that with most verbs, the past participle has the same shape as the preterite. Occurred is like that, right? Begun isn't. But we can demonstrate that these are past participles. We just won't do it right now. All right. Now the thing about the secondary tense system is that it works at the same time as the primary tense system. The sentences are not choosing one of those to go into. Both of them are operative, so we can have like this, filmmakers have begun. That sentence is perfect, right? And it's also present because we have had. Look at the second sentence. By age 9, she had begun. It's still perfect because it has the auxiliary verb have and the lexical verb in the past participle form. But it's not the same as have begun. It's had begun. So it's perfect in its secondary tense and it's past in its primary tense. Both of the systems are working at the same time. You can get present perfect or present non-perfect. You can get past perfect or past non-perfect. Then we go to the aspect system. And what you get here is something is either default or it's progressive. Here are a couple that are progressive. If your character is wearing a spacesuit, the men are carrying. How can we define the progressive? You see it, right? Auxiliary verb is be, and the lexical verb is in what form? Gerund participle. Anytime you have the auxiliary verb be and the lexical verb in the gerund participle, you have a progressive construction. Aspect can also interact with the primary tense. So to get a present progressive, you use a present form of be, like am, is, are, and you use the lexical verb in the gerund participle, so you get things like I am changing, she is changing, they are changing, right? You can also have a past progressive. All you do is put the be into the past tense. So you get I was changing, you were changing, they were changing. So aspect interacts with the primary tense. Does it interact with the secondary tense? Yes, you can have progressive and perfect at the same time. Take the sentence, it's hard to say, the clause, what Tom is thinking. Take the clause, what Tom is thinking, inside the sentence. It's hard to say what Tom is thinking. Change the auxiliary verb be to its past participle form, been, and then add the auxiliary that you need for perfect, which is have. And you get Tom has been thinking. Is this perfect? Yeah, it has the auxiliary verb have, and it has a verb, the following verb that complements it in the past participle. Is it progressive? Yeah, it has the auxiliary verb be, and the verb that complements that is in the gerund participle. So those two can work together too. Can the primary tense, the secondary tense, and the aspect all work together? Yes, this is where it gets really fun. Take this sentence. Alexandra Conover has been exploring. You have, let's see, it's definitely present tense, right? Because of has, it's not had. It's perfect because it has the auxiliary verb have, and the complement verb been is in the past participle. And it's also progressive because it has the auxiliary verb be, and the complement verb to that is a gerund participle. If you take the second sentence, Hayden had been thinking, then what do you get? Still progressive, still perfect, now it's past. So you can get a past perfect progressive as well as a present perfect progressive. In fact, you can get any of the logical possibilities, all of the logical possibilities of the intersection of these three systems all occur in English. Here's a chart that shows you. If we take, let's take the perfect progressive occurring in the past. We'll do the example here is with the verb do, right? The lexical verb is do. Okay, the present perfect progressive has been doing or have been doing. Past perfect progressive had been doing. Progressive, go to the right side of your chart now, right top corner. Progressive that's not perfect, so just progressive default in the present. It's is doing, in the past it's was doing or were doing. Now let's look at the perfect but not progressive. We get the present tense has done or have done. That's the present perfect. The past perfect had done. And then we have the default of all, the one that's neither perfect nor progressive. It's in the present tense does or do, and in the past tense did. And you could work this table for any verb. Almost any verb in English. Okay, there are some that are a little weird and don't take every possible form, but the vast majority of verbs in English you can put into any of these forms. So all three of the first systems completely work together. Now let's look at the last one, the mood system. It doesn't work as well, quite as well, but it does intersect pretty well with the other systems. Here are the modal verbs in English. I'm sure you're familiar with all of them. You might be thinking that you would add a few more because these are the core ones. I think, in my opinion, these are the core modal verbs of English. There are some more that have properties very much like these, so you could argue that they're modal verbs, like need. Works like that in some ways. And dare works like that especially, right? But let's take these as the ones that we're looking at right now. The system works no matter which verbs you include in it exactly or not. Here is an example of a modal sentence. Peatlands can be found throughout the tropics. Here's another one. Everything that rises, not that clause, but this one, must converge. The subject here is the clause, everything that rises. the noun phrase, everything that rises. It has a clause inside it. The main verb in this sentence, though, is the modal must. And converge is a lexical verb that is the complement of the modal must. And what do you notice about the complement of must, which is converge, and the complement of can, which is be? What form are those verbs in? Are you seeing it? With the be, it's especially obvious, right? It's the plain form. Modal auxiliaries have a plain form verb as their complement. So the fourth system of English, the modal, we say that a clause is modal if it has a modal verb and then the lexical verb following it, or the verb that complements it is in the plain form. A sentence is non-modal if there's not a modal verb. It's just as simple as that. Right. Here is how the modal works with perfect. You get, instead of I should bring, that would be a modal. This is also modal, I should have brought, but it's a perfect modal because you have, and the complement of have is the past participle. I have brought along another bucket is a perfect construction. I should have brought along another bucket is a modal perfect construction. Here's another one with might. The Cutler Saga might have been. Been is the lexical verb. It's in its past participle form because this is a perfect construction and it's the complement of have. Have is in its base form, its plain form, because it's the complement of the modal might. And more fun because the modals can also interact with the progressive, with the aspect. So we get here, the place would be closing. Some here may be wondering. You have the modal verb would or may, and then you have the auxiliary that you need for the progressive, which is be, right? It has to go into its plain form because that's what modal verbs require. They require a complement in their plain form. And then the auxiliary be, in order to make a progressive construction, requires a complement in the gerund participle, so you get closing and wondering. So those sentences are modal and progressive at the same time. Can a sentence be modal and perfect and progressive? It can. You can have, I will have been representing. From the clench of her hand, she might have been grappling. So we can make a table similar to the one that we made for non-modals, but make one for modals. We can, again, use do as the lexical verb, okay? So perfect progressive, a modal verb, say may or can or should or would, may have been doing, should have been doing. That is present, perfect, and progressive. One that's progressive but not perfect, may be doing, should be doing, can be doing. One that's perfect but not progressive, may have done, should have done, could have done, must have done. And one that's neither perfect nor progressive, it's modal and then otherwise default, is just may do, can do, will do. Now, the difference between this table and the last table, are you catching it? We didn't have a past one in each of these squares. Our other table, we could see that within the intersection of perfect and progressive, there was both a present form and a past form. There was a third dimension happening. With the modal verbs, you can't get that. The reason is pretty much that some of the modal verbs are preterite themselves. So, like, let's see, would is the preterite form of will, and could is the preterite form of can. You know that, at least subconsciously and probably consciously, but you already know that if you want to say, if you're talking about something in the present, like, my kid can tie her shoes, and if you wanted to switch that to past, you would say, my kid could tie her shoes when she was 6, right? You already know that could is the preterite of can, and would is pretty much the preterite of will, although modals have evolved to have uses that we don't usually associate with preterites, but still. That sort of explains why the modals don't have past tense forms similar to that intersect in ways similar to the perfect system and the progressive system, because the modals sort of have their own preterites. One final note. In many languages, perfect or non-perfect, perfect or the lack thereof, is considered an aspect and not a secondary tense. There are generally good reasons for considering it that, and they apply to some languages better than others. This is not a point that I will be a stickler about. This is not a point that's extremely important in anybody's theory as far as I know. So if you prefer to think of English as having two aspect systems and only one tense system, that's fine. If you want to say there's one tense system and then there's a perfect aspect and there's also a progressive aspect, that's fine. And then there's a mood, right? In any case, English has tense, mood, and aspect. Whether you want to call perfect part of the aspect system or part of the tense system, you can make up your mind about that. Or you can just suspend judgment on the grounds that it's not too important to think about. The thing that I do think is important is not to call the will modal a future tense. It's pretty clear that will is a modal. It's acting like all the other core modals. So to call that a tense is really pretty much muddying up the waters. And it's going to be clearer when you study other languages if you concede the point that English doesn't have a future tense. We have two tenses, and some languages have three or more.